LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of men's violence against women. Please listen with care. It's 1996 in the popular Australian holiday destination of Noosa Heads in Queensland. A 27-year-old mother of two, Samantha Bodsworth, is meant to meet a friend but never turns up. A day later, her body is found in local parklands, surrounded by wattle trees. The killer thinks it's the perfect crime, elaborately covering their tracks in a twisted Weekend at Bernie's style charade. But what they underestimated was the power of the tiny, silent witnesses clinging to almost everything they touched: pollen. In this episode, Dr. Lynne Milne, the scientist at the forefront of forensic palynology, reveals how, for the very first time ever in an Australian criminal case, pollen helped unmask a murderer. My name's Catherine Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world.
Palynology studies pollen, spores, and a few other microscopic plant bodies that you find in water.
In terms of pollen, what is it? Is it a clump of material? Are they microscopic? Is it only visible under a microscope? And what is it? Is it an amalgamation of material or...?
Each pollen grain is a single cell. You do get some of them in clumps like wattles. They have 12 or 16 grains in one sort of grain, but usually it's a single pollen grain. I mean, if you put your finger into a daisy, and there's those little yellow balls sticking up there, the anthers, rub your finger across there and you just get this yellow dust. And what it is the yellow dust has got lots and lots of microscopic cells, the pollen grains, and they've all got the same morphology. So morphology is the structure. And so pollen grains have ornamentation on them. They can have little spines, little grains and things on them, but they all have a particular shape for the same type of plant. So most, not all, but most plants produce pollen that has a particular shape of pollen morphology. It might be circular, it might be triangular, and then it'll have different little slits in it where the male sex cells come out of. Its wall structure will be different to the species that's sitting next to it that is related but not the same species.
In terms of uniqueness, how many different types or unique pollens are there?
Well, you think of how many unique plants there are. It's the same. Every plant species has pollen, and it is usually the same always from that particular species, but it's different to a species that's closely related. The exceptions to that are grasses because their pollen is just round with a single hole in it, whereas other pollen grains might have 3 or 4 slits in it plus a number of holes. They may be triangular or hexagonal. They may be fat, they may be skinny. God, I can say, okay, this pollen grain came from that plant, from that species.
Therefore, it's like it's a print, a fingerprint equivalent.
Yeah, one of my colleagues who unfortunately recently passed in the United States, he was probably one of the first forensic palynologists, and he coined the phrase fingerprints of plants. And some of the surface structures of pollen grains, if you put them in a high-powered electron microscope, it does look like fingerprints. And I've had some of my work in art exhibition showing that, huge thing of just 10 microns of a surface of a pollen grain. It's just stunning.
So tell us, when you were approached with this case involving pollen from Queensland,
Well, this 27-year-old mother of two little boys, 4 and 6, she'd broken up with her de facto. He'd always said he would kill her if she left. And anyway, her body was found in Noosa Woods. I think the locals call it the Spit, if you know Noosa.
Well, for those who don't, Noosa is in northern Queensland.
Yes, it's a couple of hours north of Brisbane. And she was found there one morning. The night before, she was meant to meet a girlfriend, and she didn't. And it turned out that her ex-partner had murdered her and then moved her body from Gympie. So she lived in Gympie, took her body in her car to Noosa Heads and dragged her body into the bushland there, because it's a park area where there's car parks, and it's right near the beach, so you can walk down to the beach. So it was in there, in amongst the bushland, that her body was found. And the police had this person who was working with me, another PhD student, doing sort of palynology, but not the detailed work that I do. Initially, they thought that she had gone to a nightclub, met somebody there, left her car at the nightclub, gone with somebody to Noosa, to a club, and then they'd killed her. Anyway, there were particular things about the clothes she was wearing and such that made her parents suspect that she hadn't gone to a nightclub. She had no makeup on. She rarely went out without makeup. She had clothes on that didn't sort of match. And the police found in her car outside the nightclub, they found a wattle flower on the floor of the driver's side, and there was one on the number plate. Now, there were no wattle flowers flowering in Gympie at the time, no wattle plants, but they were in great bloom in Gympie. And so they figured that her car may have been used to take her to Noosa and then brought back to Gympie and left there. So they vacuumed the driver's side of the car and they picked up the wattle flowers. And what they wanted to know was, were those wattle flowers from Noosa?
In terms of what the police found when they examined the car, obviously the pollen sources was something that they were tuned into quickly, or was it just because of what they found in the car, the plant material that they found in the car?
Well, the fact that this girl was being funded by the police department, Queensland Police, to do her PhD, looking at pollen from different regions of Queensland, and she'd given a talk at the police department, they then thought, okay, so we found these flowers. Can we tell if they are the flowers from Noosa or from Gympie? And that's when they asked her to have a look at the clothing. His clothing was washed and hanging on a line at the hotel that he was staying at. And they took his clothing the night of the day that she was found. There was a shirt and some jeans. And then they got Samantha's car and vacuumed the driver's side.
Does pollen wash out of clothes that easily?
That's a very good question, because that's a question that's been asked quite a lot. And so I had a master's student test that. And so what we did is we simulated a rape. And so we got these brand new T-shirts and some old jeans, and we got 9 sets of jeans and T-shirts, and we washed them a lot. And then we wore them. And with the jeans, we used the knees on the ground for about 30 seconds and lay on our back and rubbed our backs in the dirt for about 30 seconds, shook off the dirt, and one lot we took the soil from it and processed it and got the pollen out. Another lot we wore for 3 days and then got the pollen. And another lot we washed. We washed them each separately, and then we soaked them in water to see if we could get some pollen out. We got thousands of pollen grains out of the one that was washed and also from the one that we'd worn for 3 days each. So yes, you can get pollen out of clothing that's been washed.
How on earth are flowers supposed to have I can understand transferring material like pollen from dirt or from knees and that sort of thing. But actual flowers, how did actual flowers get into a car?
Yeah, well, what happened is at the time in Noosa Heads, in the spit area where she was found, there was 2 types of wattle plants flowering and just massive. And right near where Samantha was, there was a whole pile of wattle. It was called Acacia sopherae then. It's now called Acacia longifolia sopherae. And it was flowering from the ground to about man height. And if he had, which we believe he backed the car in, and she was in the passenger side, and when he went around, he had to brush past all of these flowers and to drag her out. And then when he dragged her in through the bushes, he pulled out a lot of these small plants that were flowering as well. And they were, all the same species. And she was covered with these little juvenile wattle plants. And so I suspect as he was doing that, it maybe got on his shoe or fell onto his, sock, and he's got in the car, and that's knocked off onto the floor. As for the rear number plate, he would have been backing almost into these plants, and it would be very easy for one to get stuck on the number plate.
In terms of the body then, that didn't help so much, I imagine, if the body had flowers from the exact region in which she was found on her. So that doesn't give you any clues, because the first thing is to think, if she were killed somewhere else, would she have pollen from somewhere else on her?
From somewhere else, yes.
Did anyone look at that?
Well, there wasn't any need, because her car was found in Gympie, not Noosa, and it had these wattle flowers in it. Therefore, who had been driving that car? We believed that her body had been taken to Noosa in that car and then driven back to Gympie. So they got the clothing from her de facto to see if he had pollen from Noosa on him. And if the pollen that was on the floor and on the rear bumper and vacuumed from the driver's side, if that was the Noosa pollen. So if they could link him to the car was linked to Noosa.
If he's washed his clothes then at the hotel, did you set about trying to find out if the pollen from the car matched any pollen that was on his clothing from Noosa?
Yes. We found that it matched. The girl that was working on the case before me, she did tape lifts of the clothing, and she had looked under the microscope to find wattle pollen. And she'd found 8, I think 6 on the shirt and 2 on the pants. But she didn't know how to process them. She couldn't tell the difference between the 2 species, or there was wattle plants that were growing in Gympie but not flowering. She didn't know whether they came from the Noosa one or whether, from somewhere else or from a different species. So what I did is I looked at the pollen from the actual flowers, and it was the same as the stuff in the pollen from the plants in Noosa. So we knew that. And then it was a matter of linking what was on the car seat and the vacuumings and what was on his clothing. And they all turned out to be the same species. So we put him at Noosa in the car.
Does vacuuming a car, for example, disturb that, or are you able to isolate the pollens without any trouble if they've all been vacuumed up into the one bag?
I can isolate the pollen from the stuff that's in the bag. So what we do is we have to get rid of the minerals. The primary minerals are quartz and clays. They're all silicates. So we put those in a nasty chemical called hydrofluoric acid. We get rid of the carbonates, the limestone, with hydrochloric acid. And so for me to get pollen out of soil or from dust and stuff that I get from clothing, if I wash clothing, or just, let's say if I'm doing a rape, I'll just do the guy's knees and I just put that in water and squeeze it all out. And then I spin it down in a centrifuge and I get all the solids. And then I have to get rid of the minerals and that isolates the organic matter and the pollen survives. And then I do another chemical process that gets rid of the insides of the pollen, because the pollen is a single cell and it's got protoplasm inside. And often they're sticky, so I have to get rid of that so I can see the wall structure. Most chemicals do not destroy pollen.
You mentioned that you thought Samantha had been in the passenger seat. If he drove from...
He killed her in Gympie.
And then drove her to Noosa...
Yes.
In the passenger seat? Most people would think you'd use the boot or the back seat.
No, he put her in the passenger seat and he put a little baseball cap on her head, and then he went to the service station, I think it was the service station, drove around Gympie a bit with her in the car to make it look like she was alive. But he changed her clothing, so he killed her in her house when she had no makeup on and wasn't dressed ready to go out. And so he dressed her. And that's when the parents saw her in the morgue. They said, she hasn't gone out to any nightclub. She has been murdered at home. She has no makeup on. Her clothes are not the kind of clothes she would put on together. It was startling to her parents. I mean, they knew that he'd threatened to kill her anyway.
And I presume there's been violence in the relationship.
Yes, there had been quite a bit before.
So he's obviously the number one suspect for the police at that time.
Yes.
Did they go to him before the pollen analysis, or did they wait?
They waited. Now, this was my first forensic case, so I wasn't familiar with police speak. So when I worked out that I got the evidence, I met for a coffee with a chief inspector to give him the news. And apparently Michael Bodsworth, the suspect, had gone back to Adelaide, where he came from. And I'm sitting there having coffee and I tell this inspector, and he says, "That's fantastic." He says, "We've had the dogs on the baddie for the last couple of months. We can pick him up tomorrow." I said, "What are the dogs?" And he said, "Oh, the surveillance guys." And their suspects are called baddies, you know. This is a chief inspector. It was very interesting to me.
So then, armed with that evidence, what did the police do?
They went and they picked him up, brought him back to Queensland, and there's a photo of him coming. It was in the newspaper, and there was a headline, "Pollen Traps Killer." And there's a photo of him between two cops arriving, coming out of the airport.
Did he confess, or was there any other evidence?
Well, initially I'm told by the police that he did immediately, or during the trip from Adelaide. I think they had, and then they were in the car from Brisbane to Gympie, or they had to go to Noosa, I think. And I understand that in a car, either in South Australia or in Queensland, he did intimate that he had done it. But then, of course, you know, that wasn't recorded. It's not whatever, and he can retract that. So he did.
Did you have to appear in court with your evidence?
I appeared at the committal, and I'd never been in court before. I have no idea. The police, they're just very jolly, you know. "You'll be right, mate." Okay, so I'm sitting in the witness room. I'm in there all morning with all the other witnesses, and we went and we had lunch. And when we came back, I was to be the second and the last witness. And I asked the cops again, you know, "Can you give me some tips?" And they said, "Nah, mate, you'll be right. You're just the icing on the cake." I said, "Okay," not realising that they meant that my evidence was the most crucial. So I'm waiting outside for my turn to go in after lunch, and there's a reporter there, and I ask her, "If you've got any tips, and what's the defence lawyer like?" Because I suspect he's going to grill me. And she said, oh, look, he's a bit of a bull. He'll give you a hard time. And I said, so can you give me some idea of, some tactics and things? And she said, well, just when he's asking you to answer a question, he'll say yes or no, answer my question. If you can't answer it and you don't want to answer it that way, you just say, turn to the magistrate and say, look, I can't answer that in the affirmative or negative. I did get a bit upset. I was about to burst into tears. I looked down at my fingernails and I thought, he's not going to get me. I'm going to handle this. So, yeah, I did in the end.
It's so sad to think that you've got your science evidence and someone can rattle you with words and intimidation tactics. And if you had crumbled, then that case may not have got to trial.
That's right, yes. You have to be very careful not to show that you're definitely on the side of the prosecution or defence. You have to make sure you're just talking about your science.
If that was the first case that pollen was used in Australia, did you find the defence team sceptical about the science or trying to imply that it's not a real science, that it's like junk science?
Yeah, that was very interesting. They bought out a TV in those days. They had a video on it, and what they'd done is they had taken a video of all the grasses and the trees and things around the site, and they asked me to name the plants to try and discredit me. And I said, I'm not a botanist. I just look at their pollen. And they kept on, name this plant, name that plant. And I just had to keep saying, I'm not a botanist. I can't answer that question. And it's not relevant because I look at pollen.
You did something else that was interesting about the Bodsworth case that obviously had a big impact on you. You became close to Samantha's children.
I did. I haven't seen them for about 5 years now. They're grown men with their own families. About 6 years after Samantha was killed, I was asked by a publishing company to write a book. They rang me and said, we'd like to talk to you about a forensic book. And so I thought they meant a chapter in a forensic textbook. And of course, I had lunch with this lady and she said they wanted me to write a Kathy Reichs type crime fiction book and use the Bodsworth case as the basis of it. Anyway, I said, look, I'll write science. I actually write very funny Christmas letters, according to my friends. And they said, yeah, okay. So popular science, the Bodsworth case, and a bit of Bill Bryson type. I said, yeah, I can do that. They said, just write what you think might be the first chapter. So I went home and I thought, okay, I just wrote. And it turned out it only took me like a day. I thought, this is going to be really easy. So I sent it off to them. And they said, yeah, you can write. That's fabulous. So it's still the first chapter in my book, apart from the last paragraph. I wasn't prepared to write about the case unless I had some contact with Samantha's family. And so I eventually managed to get over east because I was back in Western Australia and I had a trip to Sydney paid for me, so I thought I'll pay the extra bit and go up and see the police and ask them to ask Samantha's family if they would mind if I wrote about her case. Would they like me to set it in another state, use different names, or to use Samantha's actual name? Anyway, the police, I was on my way up to Noosa to go to the site and take photos, and I was going to drop in and see the police in Caloundra on the way. So I went on up to Noosa and I'd booked in there to stay the night. And I went and I took some photos in the park there where Samantha was found, and there was a little cross there that said Sam on it, and it said, "We will never forget you, Michael, Corey, Mum and Dad." And sent shivers through my spine. I mean, it was really weird. I'd not felt that before because you don't have a connection with the people involved, with the victims, and you just do your science. Anyway, I thought something had been puzzling me that I couldn't understand why Michael Bodsworth didn't leave Sam's body somewhere else than somewhere that it was easy to find. And it turns out he'd made this elaborate plan and he wanted her to be found. So I thought I'll just drive from here up the road to Noosa and have a look at the vegetation and see if that would be a smart place to leave a body. And finally, I ended up in Gympie, and I thought, oops, here I am, no map. And so I thought I'll take the ring road. So I went around the outside, and then there was this sign that said to the Mount Pleasant Hotel. And the Mount Pleasant Hotel had been where Michael Bodsworth had been staying, living. And so I thought, okay, I'll go in and see the guy in the bottle shop and ask him about some other places that were part of the case. Like there was the Woolworths car park where Michael Bodsworth's car was broken down. And I said, can you show me where the Woolworths car park is? He said, oh yeah, go down this street and up there and whatever. I said, okay, thanks. Anyway, I'm walking away and I thought, geez, you're gutless, Lynne, and go back. Ask him if he knows anything about the case. So I went back and I said, look, I'm doing some research because I'm writing a book on a murder case that I was involved in. He didn't want to say much. And I said, look, they used my evidence to convict him. And he said, oh, you're the Pollen lady. I said, yes, the Pollen lady. Anyway, he said, oh, look, you've got to go and meet her parents. And I said, look, I don't want to do that. I'll get the police to contact them. Anyway, he said, look, give me your phone number. So I took off into Gympie thinking nothing more of that, and have a look around and go back and have dinner. And anyway, I got a phone call about 10 minutes later, and this guy said, it's Dave from the bottle shop. He said, you've got to come back. He said, they want to see you now. What? Anyway, I went back and he gave me directions to their little farm, 17 kilometres along a dirt road. And I got there just at dusk and I was in tears. I start crying now. I was so emotional. Yeah. So I met the grandparents I met Samantha's parents and little boys. They wanted me to tell Sam's story. So I did. With their help. They helped me a lot with a lot of the background and stuff. And the boys then, I think Michael must have been 10 or 11, he's the eldest one, and Corey was about 7. And they lived on this amazing little property with lots of cows and Clydesdales and ducks and geese and you name it. And there was a rainforest down the bottom of the hill and a dam and creeks and they'd take me running through there and climbing up and down things, just like I was a big sister. It was amazing. And then I had to watch all these kids' movies with them. Yeah, so very special.
And how did the family react when they read the book?
They're very happy. I wrote in a book for each of the boys, just a special message to them. Both Malcolm and Lynne have now passed on, sadly. But Sam's brother, his wife, is fabulous, and she's there for the boys and their kids, so they're like her grandchildren. But the grandparents raised these 2 boys. They had an idyllic childhood on this farm, but with the shadow of their mum having been murdered and their dad in jail.
Lynne, thank you so much for talking to us today and taking us through palynology and forensic palynology. I am going to respect the pollen even if they cause me hay fever. I'm going to respect them more than ever now.
Good. Lovely to talk to you, Catherine.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Catherine Fox, and produced by Holly Mitchell and Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.